Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. In the vast expanse of the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions meet modern law enforcement, tribal police officers serve as guardians of both people and tradition. They follow rules that exist beyond conventional law enforcement rules that have kept their people safe for generations. These are the stories of those who patrol the darkness, following protocols not written in any manual, but passed down through generations. Rules that keep them alive when facing what the modern world cannot explain. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was late October of 2014. Officer Michael Begay had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 3 years, assigned to the Shiprock district. The autumn chill had already settled over the high desert, bringing with it early nights and an eerie silence to the landscape. Begay's shift began at sunset, as it often did during the winter months. He checked his cruiser at the station, making sure the emergency lights worked and that he had extra fuel. The dispatcher handed him the patrol log with a knowing look. "Be careful out there, Mike. The wind's been strange today." The first few hours passed uneventfully. Begay drove the familiar routes through Shiprock and the surrounding communities, checking on the elderly residents who lived alone and breaking up the occasional domestic disturbance. Around 9:47 p.m., dispatch called with a report of a stranded vehicle on Highway 491 near the turnoff to the community of Beclabito. When Begay arrived, he found a minivan pulled to the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. A woman stood beside it, wrapped in a blanket despite the relatively mild evening. Begay approached cautiously, noting that the woman seemed agitated, her eyes darting to the surrounding darkness. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" Begay asked, keeping his flashlight beam low. "My husband, he went for help," she said, her voice trembling. "About an hour ago. He said he was going to walk to that gas station we passed back up the road." Begay radioed dispatch with the information and requested that they check with the gas station. While waiting for a response, he examined the vehicle. The engine was cold, suggesting it had been stopped for some time. The driver's side door was ajar, and a half-empty water bottle sat on the dashboard. The dispatcher came back with concerning news. "No one at the gas station has seen anyone matching the description. The attendant says no one has come in on foot in the past 2 hours." Begay turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, are you sure your husband went toward the gas station? Which direction did he head?" The woman pointed north, toward the open desert. "That way. He said he'd be right back. But it's been so long." Her voice trailed off as she looked into the darkness. Begay called for backup and began organizing a search of the area. 2 additional officers arrived within 20 minutes, and they began methodically searching the roadside and the desert beyond. The landscape was illuminated by their flashlights, creating moving shadows that played tricks on the eyes. After nearly an hour of searching, one of the officers called out. He had found footprints leading away from the road, but they disappeared after about 50 yards, as if the person had simply vanished. There were no other tracks, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where the man might have gone. As they continued the search, Begay noticed something odd. The air had grown unnaturally still, and the usual sounds of the desert night had fallen silent. Even the wind had stopped. He glanced at his fellow officers and saw that they too had noticed the change. One of the officers, an elder named Thomas, approached Begay quietly. "We should go," he said, his voice low. "This is not our concern anymore." What do you mean? Begay asked. We have a missing person. Thomas pointed to the sky. Look, the stars. Begay looked up and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The stars were arranged in patterns he didn't recognize, as if he were looking at a completely different night sky. The familiar constellations were gone, replaced by formations he had never seen. We're between worlds, Thomas said. The old ones are walking tonight. If he went with them, there's nothing we can do. Despite Thomas's warning, Begay felt compelled to continue the search. It was his duty as an officer. But as he took another step into the desert, his radio crackled with a voice he didn't recognize. Turn back, the voice said. This is not your place. Begay froze, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. The other officers gathered around him, their faces pale in the flashlight beams. Who is this? Begay demanded into his radio. Silence answered him, followed by the sound of distant chanting in a language he couldn't understand. It seemed to come from all directions at once. The woman by the minivan suddenly cried out, pointing toward a rock formation about 100 yards away. Standing there was a figure that resembled her husband. But something was wrong. The proportions were off, the movements too fluid, too unnatural. Begay and the other officers watched in stunned silence as the figure turned toward them. Even from a distance, they could see that its eyes glowed with an internal light. It raised a hand in what might have been a wave, then stepped behind the rock formation and disappeared. The search was called off at 2:13 a.m. The missing man was never found, though his case remained open in the tribal police records. The official report noted unexplained disappearance and made no mention of the strange phenomena witnessed by the officers. Begay never spoke of what he saw that night, except to other tribal officers who understood the rules of the land. Sometimes, when he patrolled that stretch of highway alone, he would stop and listen, wondering if he could hear the chanting again. But the desert remained silent, holding its secrets close. The Navajo Tribal Police have protocols for situations like this, though they exist nowhere in writing. They are passed from officer to officer, a sacred trust that transcends conventional law enforcement. These are the night rules that keep them alive. The call came in at 11:42 p.m. on a cold November night in 2016. Officer Sarah Yazzie had just finished her dinner break when dispatch informed her of strange lights reported near the Bisti-Denizin Wilderness area. 2 hikers had called in, panicked, saying they were being watched by something they couldn't identify. The dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual urgency, a subtle indication that this was not a routine call. Bisti after dark was not a place where experienced officers wanted to venture, especially not in response to reports of unidentified phenomena. Yazzie knew the area well. The Bisti Badlands were a strange landscape of hoodoos and rock formations that seemed to belong to another planet. By day, tourists marveled at the otherworldly scenery, taking photographs of the bizarre geological formations that rose from the desert floor like ancient sculptures. By night, locals avoided the place, citing stories that went back generations. The Navajo name for the area translated roughly to the place where the world turns upside down, a reference to the strange geological formations and the even stranger phenomena reported there over the centuries. Yazzie's grandfather had warned her about Bisti since she was a child, telling her stories that made her skin crawl even as an adult. As Yazzie drove her cruiser toward the wilderness area, she thought about what her grandfather had told her about Bisti. The rocks there remember, he had said. They remember when the world was young, and they remember the beings that walked it before us. He had described encounters his own grandfather had told him about, strange lights that danced among the hoodoos, figures that moved too quickly to be human, sounds that had no identifiable source. These stories were part of the oral tradition of the Diné, passed down through generations as warnings and as explanations for the inexplicable. Yazi, despite her modern education and police training, had never been able to completely dismiss these stories, especially not after some of the things she had witnessed during her years with the tribal police. The hikers had left their vehicle at the main trailhead, and Yazi found it exactly where they said it would be. The doors were unlocked, and a cell phone was lying on the driver's seat. When Yazi picked it up, she saw that the last photo taken showed a dark figure standing on a ridge, illuminated by an internal glow that cast no shadows. The image was unsettling. The figure was tall and slender, with proportions that seemed almost human, but not quite. The light it emitted was pale blue, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding rocks. Yazi felt a chill as she examined the photo. Something about the figure's posture suggesting an ancient intelligence that was observing rather than threatening. She radioed dispatch to report her findings and requested backup before proceeding into the Badlands. As she waited, she examined the area around the vehicle. There were footprints, at least 3 sets, leading into the wilderness, but none coming back. The tracks were human-like, but unusually long and narrow, with no discernible tread pattern. They seemed to press into the hard-packed earth with an unnatural depth, as if whatever made them was heavier than it appeared. Yazi documented the tracks with photographs, noting their direction and the distance between steps. Something about the tracks bothered her, a subtle wrongness that she couldn't immediately identify, but that set her teeth on edge. Officer Daniel Tsosi arrived 20 minutes later, his cruiser kicking up a cloud of red dust in the darkness. Tsosi was older than Yazi, nearing retirement, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock formations that dominated the landscape. He had grown up in the area and knew Bisti as well as anyone, perhaps better than most. "What have we got, Sarah?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes alert as he scanned the surrounding darkness. 2 missing hikers. Strange lights reported. Yazi replied, showing him the photograph on the cell phone. And tracks leading into the Badlands. No tracks coming back. Tsosi examined the photo and the tracks, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "This isn't good," he said quietly. "Not good at all." He walked around the vehicle, his flashlight beam sweeping across the desert floor. They went in prepared enough, water, supplies, but they didn't come back out. And whatever they went in after, or whatever went in after them, it's still out there. Together, they entered the Badlands, following the tracks with powerful flashlights. The landscape was disorienting, even for experienced officers like themselves. Rock formations rose like ancient sentinels, casting shadows that seemed to move when they weren't looking directly at them. The air was still and cold, carrying a scent of dust and something else. Something ancient and organic, like the smell of a cave that had been sealed for thousands of years. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, as if the landscape were absorbing and then replaying the sounds with a slight delay. After walking for about half a mile, they found the first flashlight lying on the ground, still on, but dimming. Nearby was a water bottle, half full. Yazi called out the hikers' names, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. The beam of the abandoned flashlight cast eerie shadows on the surrounding rock formations, creating illusions of movement in the peripheral vision. Tsosi knelt to examine the area, his gloved hands tracing the outline of the tracks in the dust. "They stopped here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something made them stop suddenly. The tracks are deeper here, as if they were standing their ground. Then they scatter, going in different directions. One set continues forward, the others They're dragged or carried or something. He pointed to irregular marks in the soil that suggested a struggle, though the marks were unlike anything Yazzie had seen before. Too wide to be from a human body, too irregular to be from an animal. As they continued deeper into the Badlands, Tsosi suddenly stopped and grabbed Yazzie's arm. "Listen," he whispered. Yazzie strained to hear above the sound of her own breathing. There it was, a faint, rhythmic sound, like stones clicking together. It seemed to come from ahead of them, beyond a row of hoodoos that resembled petrified giants. The sound was steady and deliberate, creating a pattern that was almost musical but entirely alien. It seemed to resonate in her chest, a physical vibration that was more felt than heard. "What is that?" Yazzie asked, her hand instinctively moving toward her sidearm. Tsosi shook his head, his expression grim in the flashlight beam. Nothing good, nothing natural. He scanned the darkness ahead, his flashlight beam sweeping across the bizarre rock formations. "We need to be careful here. This isn't a normal rescue operation anymore." They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, using the rock formations for cover. The clicking sound grew louder as they advanced, more complex now, with multiple rhythms interweaving in patterns that seemed to shift and change. The air grew colder, and Yazzie felt the hairs on her arms stand up. There was an electrical quality to the atmosphere, like the feeling before a lightning strike, though the sky above was clear and filled with stars. As they rounded the last hoodoo, they saw something that defied explanation. 3 figures stood in a circle around a 4th figure lying on the ground. The standing figures were tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. They made the clicking sound with what appeared to be elongated fingers, tapping them together in a complex rhythm. Their bodies seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a silhouette that was darker than the surrounding night. The figure on the ground was one of the hikers, alive but seemingly paralyzed, eyes wide with terror. His body was rigid, his limbs frozen in a position that suggested he had been attempting to crawl away when whatever had hold of him had caught him. The other hiker was nowhere in sight. Yazzie felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of wrongness. Everything about this scene violated the natural order as she understood it. Yazzie and Tsosi watched in frozen silence, unsure how to proceed. Their training had not prepared them for this. Standard procedure would be to announce their presence and order the suspects to the ground. But something told Yazzie that conventional police tactics would not work here. These beings moved with an unnatural grace, their bodies flowing rather than walking, their elongated limbs bending in ways that should have been impossible. They seemed to exist in a space between dimensions, sometimes appearing solid and sometimes almost transparent. Before they could decide on a course of action, one of the figures turned its head toward them. It had no face, just a smooth surface that somehow seemed to be looking directly at them. The clicking stopped, and the air grew unnaturally still. The figure raised an arm that was too long, too thin, and pointed a finger that ended in what looked like a sharpened stone. "Leave," a voice said, though none of the figures appeared to have mouths. The sound seemed to come from inside Yazzie's head, clear and distinct despite the lack of an obvious source. It was a voice that carried the weight of ages, filled with an authority that transcended human understanding. Tsosi raised his weapon, but Yazzie put a hand on his arm. "No," she whispered. "We go." They backed away slowly, never taking their eyes off the figures. The beings watched them depart, their faceless heads following their movement with an unnatural stillness. When they were safely behind the row of hoodoos, they turned and ran, not stopping until they reached the cruiser. The engine started with a reluctance that suggested even the mechanical systems were affected by whatever they had encountered, and they sped away from the Badlands, leaving the hikers to their fate. Additional officers arrived at first light, and a full search was conducted. They found the paralyzed hiker exactly where Yazzie and Sosi had left him, but he had no memory of what had happened. The other hiker was never found. The official report cited possible hallucinogenic exposure and heat exhaustion, though the temperature had barely reached 50 degrees the previous day. There was no mention of the figures, no acknowledgement of the impossible things Yazzie and Sosi had witnessed. It was as if the entire incident had been filed away in a category of things that could not be explained, and therefore could not be officially acknowledged. Yazzie and Sosi never spoke of what they had seen, but they both understood that they had crossed a boundary that night. They had witnessed something ancient and powerful, something that existed outside the realm of normal human experience. In the weeks that followed, they both requested transfers to different districts, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of being marked by whatever they had encountered in the Bisti Badlands. Years later, when new officers joined the force, they would be told the unofficial rules of patrolling near Bisti. Never go there after dark, the senior officers would say. If you see lights that don't match any known source, you report them and you stay away. If you hear clicking sounds, you leave immediately. These aren't suggestions. They're survival instructions. These rules were passed down from officer to officer, a part of the unwritten knowledge that complemented the official procedures and regulations. The Navajo people have known for generations that there are places where the veil between worlds is thin. Bisti is one of those places, and the tribal police who patrol those boundaries serve as guardians not just of the people, but of the boundaries themselves. They understand that there are forces at work in the world that defy modern explanation, and that their duties sometimes require them to operate according to protocols that have been passed down through generations. These are the night rules that keep them alive. Officer John Nez was working the graveyard shift on December 20th, 2017, the winter solstice and the longest night of the year. At 3:17 a.m., he was patrolling the remote stretch of Highway 64 that runs through the northern part of the reservation, a desolate area with no services for miles in either direction. The solstice had always been a time of heightened awareness for Nez, a date marked in his grandmother's calendar with symbols that he had never fully understood, but had learned to respect. The night was exceptionally dark, with no moon and heavy cloud cover obscuring the stars. Nez had his cruiser's headlights on high beam, but they seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness, creating a bubble of visibility that extended only a few dozen feet ahead before being consumed by the blackness. He had been driving for nearly 2 hours without seeing another vehicle, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on him. The dashboard clock glowed with a pale green light, marking the slow passage of time in what felt like a void between worlds. Nez had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 6 years, but this was his first winter solstice patrol on this particular stretch of highway. His grandmother had warned him about this night specifically, her voice serious as she explained that the boundaries between worlds were at their thinnest during the solstice. Some things walk that normally stay hidden, she had told him, her eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the physical world. They are drawn to the darkness, to the places where people are few and far between. Nez had nodded respectfully, though as a modern police officer, he had struggled to reconcile these traditional teachings with his training. Around 3:42 a.m., his radio crackled to life with a call from dispatch. "Officer Nez, We have a report of a disabled vehicle near mile marker 47. Can you respond? The dispatcher's voice was clear, cutting through the static that had been his only companion for the past hour. 10-4, Nez replied, checking his location on the cruiser's GPS. He was about 10 miles from the reported position, so it would take him roughly 10 minutes to reach the vehicle. The road ahead stretched into darkness, a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to dissolve into nothingness beyond the reach of his headlights. As he drove, he thought about the strange calls that often came in on nights like this. The winter solstice was considered a significant time in Navajo tradition, a moment when the natural world was in balance and the boundaries between realms were at their thinnest. His grandmother had always warned him to be careful on such nights, sharing stories of encounters that defied explanation. Vehicles that appeared and disappeared, voices that spoke without bodies, figures that moved too quickly to be human. Nez had always listened respectfully, though part of him remained skeptical, attributing these tales to superstition and the power of suggestion. The landscape along Highway 64 was barren and unforgiving, with rocky outcrops and scrub vegetation that seemed to barely cling to life in the harsh desert environment. Occasionally, a roadside shrine would appear, a small collection of stones, feathers, and other offerings left by those seeking protection or giving thanks for safe passage. Nez had always found these shrines comforting, tangible evidence of a spiritual presence that existed alongside the physical world. Tonight, however, they seemed ominous, their shadows elongated and distorted by his headlights. When Nez reached mile marker 47, he saw no sign of a disabled vehicle. He slowed his cruiser and scanned the area with his spotlight, but the highway was empty. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but asphalt and desert. He radioed dispatch to report his findings, his voice steady despite the unease that was beginning to creep over him. "Are you sure you're at the right location?" the dispatcher asked. The caller was very specific about mile marker 47, said they'd broken down and needed assistance. Nez confirmed his position and decided to check a mile in each direction. Still nothing. He was about to call off the search when his radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. "You should not be here," a voice said, calm and clear. It was a man's voice, but it had an odd quality to it, as if it were coming from a great distance, yet was somehow perfectly clear, as if speaking directly inside Nez's head. "Who is this?" Nez demanded, his hand moving to his sidearm out of instinct. His training took over even as his mind struggled to process the impossible situation. Unauthorized radio transmissions were not uncommon, but there was something different about this voice, something that set off alarm bells deep in his subconscious. "This is not your concern," the voice replied. "Turn around and go back." Nez checked his radio settings, thinking he might be picking up another frequency, but everything was normal. He tried calling dispatch, but there was only static, a hissing, crackling sound that seemed to mock his attempt to establish contact. The isolation that had been merely uncomfortable moments before now felt threatening, as if he were being deliberately cut off. "You cannot call for help," the voice said, as if reading his thoughts. "Not from here." Nez felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He was alone on a deserted highway, miles from any help, and someone was playing with his radio system. He decided to return to the station and report the incident. But when he put the cruiser in gear, the engine died. The dashboard lights flickered and went out, leaving Nez in almost complete darkness, broken only by the dim glow of his emergency radio backup. He tried the engine again, but there was no response. His flashlight worked, but when he swept it across the highway, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing about 50 yards ahead of him was a figure dressed in what looked like a traditional Navajo rug, worn like a cloak. The figure was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and stood perfectly still despite the wind that had begun to blow, kicking up dust and debris from the roadside. Nez drew his weapon and aimed at the figure, his training taking over despite the supernatural nature of the encounter. "Navajo Tribal Police, identify yourself!" he called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. The figure took a step forward, and Nez saw that beneath the rug, it was not human. The limbs were too long, the proportions wrong. It raised an arm that was more like a branch than a limb, and pointed directly at Nez. The rug fell away slightly, revealing what appeared to be bark-like skin and joints that bent in ways that human joints should not. The radio came to life again, with the same voice as before. "I warned you." Nez decided to make a run for it. He opened his door and sprinted away from the cruiser, heading south down the highway. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear the sound of something following him. Not footsteps, but a strange scraping sound, like branches being dragged across pavement. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing in the darkness as if the desert itself were coming alive around him. After running for what seemed like an eternity, his lungs burning and his legs aching, he risked a glance back. The figure was no longer visible, but his cruiser was gone. In its place stood a single juniper tree that hadn't been there before, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Nez stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The tree hadn't been there when he passed this spot earlier. He was certain of it. Nez continued running until he saw headlights approaching from the south. It was a truck driven by a local rancher who recognized Nez's uniform and stopped to help. The rancher confirmed that there was no tree at that location, nor had there ever been in all the years he had been traveling this road. He agreed to give Nez a ride back to the station, his expression concerned as Nez tried to explain what had happened. The next day, a search party found Nez's cruiser parked at the Shiprock police station, with the keys in the ignition and a full tank of gas. There was no explanation for how it had gotten there, nor for the strange symbol drawn in the dust on the hood, a spiral with lines radiating outward, resembling a spider's web. The symbol was familiar to some of the older officers, who recognized it as a sign associated with certain ceremonies and entities that were not to be spoken of lightly. Nez never worked the graveyard shift again, and he never patrolled that stretch of highway alone. Other officers reported similar experiences on the winter solstice, though none would speak of it officially. The unofficial protocol became to avoid certain areas during specific times of the year, following rules that had been passed down through generations. These rules were never written down, never discussed in formal settings, but they were understood by those who had encountered things that defied explanation. The Navajo Tribal Police understand that there are forces at work in the desert night that defy modern understanding. They serve as mediators between the modern world and the ancient one, following protocols that keep both realms in balance. These are the night rules that keep them alive. Rules that acknowledge the existence of things that cannot be explained by science or logic. Things that must be respected rather than confronted. Nez's grandmother had tried to prepare him for such encounters, though he had not truly understood her warnings until that night. "The world is not as simple as it seems," she had told him. "There are things that walk between worlds, things that have their own laws and their own purposes. The best we can do is recognize when we have stepped into their territory and give them the respect they are due." In the years that followed, Nez became one of the elders of the tribal police, the one who quietly passed on the night rules to new officers who would be patrolling the remote areas of the reservation. He never spoke directly of his own experience, but he taught others to recognize the signs. The unusual silence that sometimes fell over the desert, the feeling of being watched when no one was there. The inexplicable malfunctions of equipment in certain locations at certain times. The winter solstice remained a time of heightened awareness, a night when officers were encouraged to stay close to populated areas and to travel in pairs if they had to venture into the more remote regions of the reservation. Most followed these guidelines without question, having heard enough stories, official and unofficial, to understand that there were things in the darkness that were best left undisturbed. The Navajo people have long understood that the world is full of mysteries that cannot be explained by modern science. They have learned to live in balance with these mysteries, to respect the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds. The tribal police, in particular, occupy a unique position between these realms, serving as guardians of both their communities and the ancient traditions that have kept their people safe for generations. The night rules are not superstition, but wisdom accumulated over centuries of experience. They are recognition that there are forces at work in the world that operate according to their own laws, forces that can be dangerous if approached without knowledge and respect. For the Navajo Tribal Police, who patrol the vast deserts and highways of the reservation, these rules are not just cultural traditions, but practical guidelines for survival. Tools for navigating a world that is far more complex and mysterious than most people realize. As Nez often told the younger officers, the desert remembers everything that has happened here, everything that still happens here when most people are asleep. Our job is not to challenge what we don't understand, but to protect our communities from things they are not prepared to encounter. Sometimes that means knowing when to turn back, when to leave something alone, when to acknowledge that we are not the only ones walking in the darkness. It was January 2018. And Officer Lucy Johnson was the only officer on duty in the small community of Nageezi, located in the eastern part of the reservation. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon that illuminated the landscape in silver light. At 1:23 a.m., Johnson received a call from an elderly woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town. The woman was speaking in Navajo, her voice trembling with fear. Johnson could understand enough to know that the woman was saying something about an animal trying to get into her house. Johnson arrived at the woman's home 10 minutes later. The house was a small traditional dwelling, with a modern addition attached to the back. As Johnson approached the front door, she could hear scratching sounds coming from around the side of the house. She knocked on the door and announced herself, and after a moment, the woman opened it, her eyes wide with terror. "It's been trying to get in for hours," she said in English. "I don't know what it is." Johnson asked the woman to describe what she had seen, but the woman was reluctant to speak of it. "It's bad luck to talk about such things," she said. "But it looks like a coyote, only bigger, and it walks on two legs." Johnson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had heard stories of such creatures all her life, but had never given them much credence. As a modern police officer, she dealt with concrete matters: theft, domestic violence, traffic violations. The supernatural was not part of her training. Despite her skepticism, Johnson drew her weapon and cautiously circled the house, flashlight in hand. The scratching sound had stopped, but she could see where something had clawed at the window frames and door. The marks were deep, as if made by powerful claws. As she rounded the corner to the back of the house, her flashlight beam fell on tracks in the sandy soil. They were unlike any animal tracks she had ever seen, larger than a coyote's, with a distinctive imprint that suggested a creature that could shift between 2 legs and 4. Johnson was examining the tracks when she heard a sound behind her. She spun around, weapon raised, and found herself face to face with something that defied explanation. It stood on 2 legs, though it was clearly animal in nature. Its body was covered in coarse fur, and its face was a horrifying mixture of human and animal features. Its eyes glowed with an intelligent malevolence that chilled Johnson to the bone. For a moment, neither moved. Then the creature spoke, in a voice that was a guttural imitation of human speech. "This is not your concern." Johnson's training took over. "Navajo Tribal Police, get on the ground." The creature laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "You have no authority here." It took a step toward Johnson, and she fired a warning shot into the air. The creature seemed unfazed, continuing its approach. Johnson fired again, this time aiming for its chest. The bullet struck home, but the creature barely flinched. Johnson realized with horror that her weapon was useless against this thing. She backed away, keeping her weapon trained on the creature until she reached the front of the house again. The elderly woman was watching from the window, her face pale with fear. "Get in your car and go," the woman called out. "Don't look back." Johnson didn't need to be told twice. She ran to her cruiser, jumped in, and locked the doors. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching her leave. Then it raised its arms and seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Johnson returned to the station and filed a report. Though she left out the more fantastical elements, she wrote it up as an encounter with an aggressive animal, possibly a rabid coyote. But she knew that what she had seen was no ordinary animal. The next day, she spoke with an elder officer who had served with the tribal police for 30 years. He listened to her story without interruption, nodding occasionally. "You saw a skinwalker," he said when she had finished. "There's no shame in running from such things. The night rules exist for a reason." He explained that skinwalkers were witches who had learned to change their form, often taking on the appearance of animals. They were dangerous and malevolent, and ordinary weapons had little effect on them. "There are ways to protect yourself," the elder officer said. "But they're not in any police manual. They're passed down from generation to generation." Johnson never spoke of her encounter again, except to other tribal officers who understood the reality of such things. She learned the traditional protections, corn pollen, cedar, specific prayers, and carried them with her on every shift. The Navajo Tribal Police occupy a unique position between two worlds. They are modern law enforcement officers, but they are also members of a community with ancient beliefs and traditions. They serve and protect their people, not just from ordinary criminals, but from forces that most people would consider imaginary. These are the night rules that keep them alive. Officer Robert Chacon had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 5 years when he was assigned to the Chaco Canyon area in March 2019. It was a coveted posting for some due to the archaeological significance of the location, but Chacon found it unsettling. The ancient ruins seemed to hold memories that whispered in the wind. On the night of March 15th, Chacon was patrolling the remote roads that led to the canyon when he received a strange call from dispatch. A group of archaeologists working at the site had reported unusual lights in the canyon after dark. They were requesting a police presence, not because they felt threatened, but because they wanted an official record of what they were witnessing. Chacon arrived at the park entrance at 9:47 p.m. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Eleanor Vance, met him at the gate. She was visibly excited, her face illuminated by the headlamp she wore. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, leading him toward the main ruins. "We've been seeing these lights for 3 nights now. They appear at roughly the same time and follow a specific pattern." As they walked, Vance explained that the lights were not like any aircraft or satellite she had ever seen. They moved with purpose, sometimes hovering over specific ruins, sometimes following the ancient roadways that connected the great houses of Chaco. When they reached the overlook above Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the great houses, Chacon saw the lights for himself. There were at least a dozen of them, glowing with a soft blue-white light that seemed to pulse rhythmically. They moved in patterns that appeared almost choreographed, as if performing an ancient ritual. Chacon radioed dispatch to report his observations, but the radio was filled with static. He tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. He was cut off from communication with the outside world. Vance seemed unconcerned. "We've had the same problem with communication," she said. "It's as if something is blocking all signals." They watched the lights for nearly an hour, Chacon documenting what he saw in his notebook while Vance took photographs with a camera that seemed to malfunction intermittently. The lights continued their strange dance, sometimes merging into a single larger light, sometimes separating into individual points that moved independently. Around 11:20 p.m., one of the lights detached from the others and began moving toward their position. Chacon instinctively reached for his sidearm, but Vance put a hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I don't think it means us any harm." The light approached slowly, hovering about 50 feet away from them. As it drew closer, Chacon could see that it was not a solid object, but rather a ball of energy that seemed to contain swirling patterns within it. It made no sound, yet Chacon felt a vibration in the air that resonated in his chest. The light remained stationary for several minutes, then suddenly shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. The other lights continued their dance for another hour before gradually fading away. Chacon and Vance returned to the park entrance, where Chacon found that his radio and cell phone were working again. He called dispatch to report his return to service, careful to describe what he had seen in neutral, observational terms. The next morning, Chacon reviewed his notes and the photographs Vance had taken. The images were strange. Most showed only blurs of light, but a few captured geometric patterns within the lights that resembled symbols found on the ancient pottery and petroglyphs of Chaco. Chacon filed his report, noting unexplained aerial phenomena and recommending further study. But he knew that there was more to what he had witnessed than could be explained by conventional science. He had seen something ancient and powerful, something that defied modern understanding. In the weeks that followed, Chacon spoke with elders from nearby communities, listening to their stories about Chaco Canyon. They spoke of the place as a center of spiritual power, a gateway between worlds where the ancestors still gathered for ceremonies. "They're not gone," one elder told Chacon. "They're just in a different place now. Sometimes, when the conditions are right, we can see them still," continuing the ceremonies they performed for thousands of years. Chacon continued to patrol the Chaco area for another year before requesting a transfer. He never saw the lights again, but he never forgot what he had witnessed. He understood that some places hold power that transcends time, and that the Navajo Tribal Police who patrol these areas serve as guardians of more than just physical boundaries. The night rules that guide the tribal police are not just about avoiding danger. They're about showing respect for forces that have existed long before modern law enforcement and will exist long after. These are the rules that keep them alive. It was a hot August night in 2020 when Officer Maria Martinez picked up what would become one of the strangest cases of her career with the Navajo Tribal Police. She was patrolling Highway 264 near the community of Ganado when she saw a figure walking along the shoulder, thumb outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Martinez approached cautiously, as she would with any roadside encounter. The figure was a young woman, possibly in her early 20s, wearing what appeared to be traditional Navajo clothing, a velvet dress and moccasins, despite the heat. Martinez noted that the woman's clothing seemed oddly clean and unwrinkled for someone who had been walking along a dusty highway. "Need some help?" Martinez asked through her cruiser window. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm trying to get to Window Rock. My family's waiting for me." Martinez considered her options. Standard procedure would be to offer a ride to the nearest town or call for a designated driver service, but something about the woman's demeanor gave Martinez pause. Still, the highway was deserted, and it would be another hour before the next scheduled patrol passed through. "Get in," Martinez said, unlocking the passenger door. "I can take you as far as Window Rock." The woman slid into the passenger seat with an odd grace, moving as if weightless. Martinez noted that she made no sound, no rustle of clothing, no creak of the seat, nothing. She also seemed to cast no shadow in the dome light of the cruiser. As they drove, Martinez attempted to make conversation, but the woman's responses were minimal and somewhat strange. She spoke of her family in Window Rock, but when Martinez asked specific questions about where they lived or what their names were, the woman's answers were vague. "They're waiting for me," she would say, her voice distant. "They've been waiting a long time." About 20 minutes into the drive, Martinez's cruiser began to malfunction. The headlights flickered, the radio filled with static, and the engine sputtered. Martinez pulled to the shoulder, concerned that they might be stranded. "Everything okay?" the woman asked, her voice calm. "I'm not sure," Martinez replied, trying the engine again. It turned over but wouldn't catch. The woman reached out and placed a hand on the dashboard. "It will be fine now," she said. To Martinez's astonishment, the engine immediately started, and all the electrical systems returned to normal. She stared at the woman, who simply smiled enigmatically. As they continued toward Window Rock, Martinez became increasingly uneasy. The woman seemed to know things she shouldn't, personal details about Martinez's life, unspoken thoughts, fears Martinez had never shared with anyone. "You worry about your mother," the woman said at one point. "Her illness will pass. She has many years ahead of her." Martinez felt a chill despite the heat. Her mother had been diagnosed with cancer the previous month, a fact she had shared with only a few close family members. "How did you know about my mother?" Martinez asked, her voice tight. The woman turned to look at Martinez, and for the first time, Martinez noticed something odd about her eyes. They seemed to contain a depth that was impossible, as if they were windows to another place and time. "We are all connected," the woman said simply. "The past, the present, the future. They are all one." As they approached the outskirts of Window Rock, Martinez began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. She had the distinct impression that she was not driving toward a destination, but rather being led somewhere against her will. "Where exactly does your family live?" Martinez asked, her hand moving toward her radio. The woman pointed to a dark stretch of road ahead. "Just beyond that bend. They're waiting in the old house." Martinez knew the area she was pointing to. It was a remote region with few residences, mostly abandoned structures from decades ago. There was no old house that she was aware of, certainly not one where a family would be waiting. "I think you need to get out here," Martinez said, pulling to the shoulder again. "I can't take you any further." The woman turned to Martinez, and her expression changed. The enigmatic smile was replaced by a look of profound sadness. "You're right. It's not time yet." She opened the door and stepped out onto the highway. As she did, Martinez noticed something impossible, and the woman's feet did not quite touch the ground, hovering perhaps an inch above the pavement. "Thank you for the ride," the woman said, closing the door gently. "We will meet again when the time is right." Martinez watched as the woman walked away from the cruiser, not toward the bend in the road, but rather toward the open desert. After a few steps, she simply vanished, as if she had walked through an invisible door. Martinez sat in her cruiser for several minutes, trying to process what she had just experienced. She checked the passenger seat. It was empty, with no impression left on the upholstery. No trace that anyone had been there at all. The next day, Martinez filed a report about the encounter, describing it as a possible hallucination due to fatigue and heat. But she knew that what she had experienced was real. She had encountered something that existed outside the normal boundaries of time and space. In the following weeks, Martinez spoke with elders about her experience. They listened without judgment, nodding knowingly when she described the woman's appearance and behavior. "You met a traveler," one elder said. "They walk between worlds, sometimes appearing to those who need guidance or a message. Your encounter was a blessing, though it may not feel like one now." Martinez's mother's cancer did indeed go into remission, just as the woman had predicted. Martinez continued to patrol the highways of the Navajo Nation. But she never picked up another hitchhiker, and she never saw the mysterious woman again. The Navajo Tribal Police understand that their duties sometimes involve encounters that defy conventional explanation. They serve as guardians, not just of their communities, but also of the boundaries between worlds, following rules that have been passed down through generations. These are the night rules that keep them alive. Officer Ben So had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 12 years when he responded to a call that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality. It was September 2021, and the monsoon season had brought heavy rains to the reservation, turning dirt roads to mud and isolating some communities for days at a time. The call came in at 10:37 p.m. from a man who identified himself as Frank Chi, living in a remote area near the Arizona border. Chi reported that someone was trying to break into his house. Though he couldn't see anyone, only sounds and the distinct impression of a presence. So knew the area well. It was sparsely populated, with homesteads spaced miles apart. The roads were barely passable in good weather and treacherous in the rain. It would take him at least 45 minutes to reach Chi's property, assuming he didn't get stuck along the way. As Tso drove, the rain intensified, his wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief flashes, revealing a world of mud, rock, and scrub vegetation that seemed almost alien in the storm. Tso felt a sense of isolation that went beyond the physical, a feeling that he was leaving the modern world behind and entering something older and more primal. When Tso finally reached Chi's property, he found a small, well-maintained house with a light burning in the window. A pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and a generator hummed somewhere nearby, providing power to the isolated home. Chi met Tso at the door, a shotgun in his hand. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice strained. "I know it sounds crazy, but something's out there." Tso asked Chi to describe what he had experienced. Chi explained that he had been watching television when he heard a knock at the door. When he looked through the peephole, he saw no one. But the knocking continued, moving from the front door to the back door, then to windows. "I thought it might be kids playing a prank," Chi said. "But then I heard scratching sounds, like something trying to get in through the walls. And there's a smell like ozone before a storm, only stronger." Tso conducted a perimeter check, finding no footprints in the mud around the house, no signs that anyone had been there. The rain had washed away any tracks that might have existed, but Tso would have expected to see some disturbance in the mud, some indication of human presence. There was nothing. As Tso was completing his examination of the property, he heard a sound that made him freeze, a faint whispering, seeming to come from all directions at once. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a summons, an invitation to something beyond the house. Chi had heard it too. His face was pale in the flashlight beam. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what I've been hearing." Tso radioed dispatch to report his findings, but the radio was filled with static. He tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. They were cut off from communication with the outside world, isolated in the storm. "We should stay inside until the storm passes," Tso said, though he had a growing sense that the house was not the safe haven Chi believed it to be. They barricaded the doors and windows, though Tso knew that if something wanted to get in, these measures would be ineffective. He sat with Chi in the living room, both men alert to any sound or movement. Around midnight, the whispering stopped, replaced by a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. It was slow and deliberate, as if something were testing the structure of the house, looking for weaknesses. Chi was becoming increasingly agitated, his knuckles white as he gripped the shotgun. "What is it?" he asked Tso. "What's out there?" Tso shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not human." The tapping continued for what seemed like hours, sometimes moving to the floor, sometimes to the ceiling. Tso had the distinct impression that they were being surrounded, that whatever was outside the house was also somehow inside with them. Around 2:30 a.m., the tapping stopped, and the house fell into an unnerving silence. Even the sound of the rain seemed muffled, as if the house had been sealed off from the outside world. Tso stood up, his weapon drawn. "Stay here," he told Chi. "I'm going to check the house." He moved cautiously through the small dwelling, checking each room. Everything was as it should be, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. But as he entered the back bedroom, he noticed something odd. The room was empty, but the indentation on the bed suggested that someone had been lying there recently. The pillow still held the impression of a head, and the sheets were disturbed as if someone had just gotten up. Tso felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He had personally checked this room when he first arrived, and it had been undisturbed. Someone or something had been in the house with them, perhaps for hours. As Tso backed out of the room, he heard a sound behind him, a soft footstep on the wooden floor. He spun around, weapon raised, but found nothing. The room was empty, yet he had the distinct impression that someone had just been standing there. "Who's there?" Tso called out, his voice tight. The only response was the sound of the front door opening, though Tso had locked it himself. He rushed back to the living room to find Chi standing in the open doorway, staring out into the rain. "What are you doing?" Tso demanded. "We need to keep the doors locked." Chi turned to look at Tso, and his eyes were vacant, his expression strangely peaceful. "They're calling," he said, his voice distant. "It's time to go." Before Tso could stop him, Chi walked out into the storm, disappearing into the darkness. Tso followed, calling after him, but the rain swallowed the sound. He searched for nearly an hour before giving up, soaked and exhausted. When Tso returned to the house, he found the door locked from the inside, though he was certain he had left it open when he went after Chi. He broke a window to gain entry and searched the house again, but found no sign that anyone had been there except himself. The next morning, the storm had passed, and Tso was able to call for backup. A search was conducted, but Frank Chi was never found. The official report listed him as a missing person, possibly a victim of the storm, though Tso knew that what had happened was far more complicated. Tso never spoke of what he had experienced that night, except to other tribal officers who understood that there were forces at work in the world that defied conventional explanation. He learned to trust his instincts, to recognize the signs that indicated the presence of something beyond the normal world. The Navajo Tribal Police serve as guardians of their communities, protecting them not just from ordinary criminals, but from forces that most people would consider imaginary. They follow rules that have been passed down through generations, protocols that exist nowhere in writing but are understood by those who patrol the boundaries between worlds. These are the night rules that keep them alive. Officer Rachel Wilson had grown up on the reservation, but she had left for college and returned only recently to join the Navajo Tribal Police. It was November 2022, and she was still learning the unofficial protocols that guided her more experienced colleagues. On the night of the full moon, Wilson was assigned to patrol the area around Shiprock, the iconic volcanic formation that gave the community its name. The night was clear and cold, with the moon casting long shadows across the landscape. Around 11:15 p.m., Wilson received a call from dispatch about a gathering at the base of Shiprock. A resident had reported seeing people with torches, possibly conducting some kind of ceremony. The caller was concerned that it might be a cult or some other illicit activity. Wilson arrived at the location to find a small group of people gathered at the base of the formation. They were dressed in traditional clothing and carried torches that cast flickering light on their faces. Wilson counted 12 people, standing in a circle around what appeared to be a fire pit. As Wilson approached, one of the figures stepped forward, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. It was an elderly man, his face weathered by years spent in the desert sun. "We mean no harm, officer," he said, his voice calm. "We are conducting a ceremony that has been performed on this night for generations." Wilson explained that she had received a call about suspicious activity and needed to investigate. The elder nodded understandingly. "You are new to this work," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "You have much to learn about the night rules." Wilson felt a surge of professional indignation. "I'm a sworn law enforcement officer," she said. "I operate according to the law and established police procedures." The elder smiled gently. "And those serve you well in the daylight world. But this is the night world, and it operates by different rules, rules that have kept our people safe for thousands of years." Despite her training, Wilson found herself intrigued. She asked the elder to explain what he meant by night rules. "There are boundaries that exist between worlds," the elder said. "Boundaries that are thinner in certain places at certain times. Shiprock is one of those places, and the full moon is one of those times. We conduct ceremonies to maintain the balance, to ensure that what belongs in the night world stays there, and what belongs in our world stays here." Wilson was skeptical, but she also felt a strange resonance with the elder's words. She had grown up hearing stories about the power of Shiprock, though she had dismissed them as superstition. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Wilson said, falling back on standard police procedure. The elder nodded and gestured to the others in the circle. One by one, they came forward, showing Wilson their tribal identification. They were all members of the local community, people she recognized from the police blotter: minor infractions, traffic violations, nothing serious. As Wilson was checking the identifications, she noticed something odd. The torches carried by the group burned with an unusual flame blue at the base, yellow at the tips, with no smoke. They illuminated the area with a light that seemed to penetrate the darkness rather than simply push it back. "What kind of fuel are you using in those torches?" Wilson asked, her curiosity overriding her professional skepticism. The elder smiled. It's a traditional recipe, passed down through generations. It helps us see what others cannot. Wilson completed her documentation and prepared to leave, but the elder stopped her. You should stay, he said. Witness the ceremony. It will help you understand the world you patrol. Wilson hesitated. Her training told her to maintain professional distance, to observe but not participate. But something in the elder's eyes compelled her to accept. I'll stay for a few minutes, she said, positioning herself where she could observe without interfering. The ceremony began with chanting in a language Wilson didn't recognize, though she had grown up hearing Navajo spoken around her. This was different, older, more complex, with rhythms that seemed to resonate in her chest. As the chanting continued, the participants began to move in a slow circle around the fire pit. Their movements were precise and coordinated, as if they had performed this ceremony countless times. The torches they carried left trails of light in the darkness, creating patterns that seemed to hang in the air. Wilson watched, mesmerized, as the ceremony reached its peak. The chanting grew louder, the movements more frantic, the light from the torches brighter. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The participants stood in silence for several minutes, their attention focused on the fire pit. Wilson followed their gaze and saw something that defied explanation. The fire in the pit was not ordinary fire. It burned with a blue-green light, and within it, images seemed to form and dissolve, faces, landscapes, symbols that seemed familiar yet alien. Wilson felt as if she were looking through a window into another time and place. The elder approached Wilson and stood beside her, looking into the fire. What do you see? He asked. Wilson struggled to find words. I see people, dressed like you, but different. They're performing a ceremony like this one, but the landscape is changed. The elder nodded. You are seeing the past, the first ceremony performed on this spot countless generations ago. The fire connects us to our ancestors, to the wisdom they gathered and passed down. Wilson continued to watch as the images in the fire changed, showing scenes from what she took to be different time periods. She saw people hunting, farming, building homes. She saw the arrival of Europeans, the establishment of the reservation, the changes that had come to the Navajo people over the centuries. As the images faded, the fire returned to its normal appearance, burning with ordinary yellow flames. The participants extinguished their torches, plunging the area into near darkness, illuminated only by the moon and the dying fire. The elder turned to Wilson. Thank you for witnessing our ceremony. I hope it helps you understand the world you patrol. Wilson left the site with a new understanding of her role as a tribal police officer. She realized that she was not just enforcing modern laws, but also serving as a guardian of ancient traditions and boundaries that existed beyond the scope of conventional law enforcement. In the months that followed, Wilson learned more about the night rules from her colleagues and from elders in the community. She came to understand that there were forces at work in the world that defied modern explanation, and that her duties sometimes required her to operate according to protocols that had been passed down through generations. The Navajo Tribal Police occupy a unique position between two worlds, serving as mediators between the modern and the ancient, the visible and the invisible. They follow rules that keep their communities safe, not just from ordinary criminals, but from forces that most people would consider imaginary. These are the night rules that keep them alive. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, especially across the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions meet modern law enforcement. The stories we've heard tonight represent just a fraction of the encounters experienced by tribal police officers who patrol the boundaries between worlds. These officers serve a unique role, functioning not just as law enforcement, but as guardians of traditions and boundaries that exist beyond the scope of conventional understanding. They follow protocols that exist nowhere in writing, rules that have been passed down through generations. The night rules that guide these officers are born of centuries of experience, of knowledge accumulated through countless encounters with forces that defy modern explanation. They are survival instructions, protective measures that keep both officers and communities safe from what lurks in the darkness. What becomes clear from these accounts is that the world is more complex than most people realize. There are boundaries between realms that can be crossed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. There are beings that exist outside our normal understanding of reality, forces that operate according to their own rules. The Navajo Tribal Police, who patrol these boundaries, do so with a respect for both worlds. They understand that some things cannot be explained by conventional science, that some phenomena require a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that has been preserved and passed down through generations. These stories remind us that there are still mysteries in the world, things that defy our understanding and challenge our perception of reality. They suggest that the modern world, with all its technology and scientific knowledge, has not eliminated the ancient mysteries that have fascinated and frightened humans for millennia. The tribal officers who shared these experiences did so with the understanding that knowledge is power, that awareness of potential dangers is the first step toward protection. They follow the night rules not out of superstition, but out of respect for forces that have demonstrated their power, time and again. What we can learn from these accounts is not just to be cautious in certain places at certain times, but to approach the world with humility and respect for what we don't understand. The Navajo people have maintained this respect for generations, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to modernization. The stories we've heard tonight also highlight the importance of community and tradition. In a world that often values individualism and innovation, there is wisdom in preserving the knowledge accumulated by those who came before us, in recognizing that some truths are timeless. As we conclude this episode, we're reminded that the world remains full of mysteries, that there are still things that defy our understanding. The Navajo Tribal Police, who patrol the boundaries between worlds, serve as guardians, not just of their communities, but of this knowledge, this understanding that the world is more complex than most people realize. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. We're always interested in verified accounts of unexplained phenomena, especially those that involve law enforcement encounters with the unknown. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.